Good day everyone, I'm Shane Mailotero and I'm going to discuss the types of decentralization, rural local government, and urban local administration. Let me present first the four types of decentralization: the political decentralization, administrative decentralization, fiscal decentralization, and the market decentralization. So the first one is political decentralization. It aims to give citizens and their elected representatives more power in public decision making. It is often associated with pluralistic politics and representative government, but it can also support democratization by giving citizens or their representatives more influence in the formulation and implementation of policies. Advocates of political decentralization assume that decisions made with greater participation will be better informed and more relevant to diverse interests in society than those made only by national political authorities. The concept implies that the selection of representatives from local electoral jurisdictions allows citizens to know better their political representatives and allows elected officials to know better the needs and desires of their constituents. Political decentralization often requires constitutional or statutory reforms, the development of pluralistic political parties, the strengthening of legislatures, creation of local political units, and the encouragement of effective public interest groups. So the second one is the administrative decentralization. It seeks to redistribute authority, responsibility, and financial resources for providing public services among different levels of government. It is the transfer of responsibility for the planning, financing, and management of certain public functions from the central government and its agencies to field units of government agencies, subordinate units or level of government, semi-autonomous public authorities or corporations, or area-wide, regional, or functional authorities. The three major forms of administrative decentralizations are deconcentration, delegation, and devolution, and each have different characteristics. So let's discuss each forms. The first one is deconcentration. It is often considered to be the weakest form of decentralization and is used most frequently in unitary states. Redistributes decision-making authority and financial and management responsibilities among different levels of the central government. It can merely shift responsibilities from central government officials in the capital city to those working in regions, provinces, or districts, or it can create strong field administration or local administrative capacity under the supervision of central government ministries. The second one is the delegation, a more extensive form of decentralization. Through delegation, central governments transfer responsibility for decision-making and administration of public functions to semi-autonomous organizations not wholly controlled by the central government but ultimately accountable to it. Governments delegate responsibilities when they create public enterprises or corporations, housing authorities, transportation authorities, special service districts, semi-autonomous school districts, regional development corporations, or special project implementation units. Usually, these organizations have a great deal of discretion in decision making. They may be exempt from constraints on regular civil service personnel and may be able to charge users directly for services. And the last one is the devolution. When the governments devolve functions, they transfer authority for decision making, finance, and management to quasi-autonomous units of local government with corporate status. Devolution usually transfers responsibilities for services to municipalities that elect their own mayors and councils, raise their own revenues, and have independent authority to make investment decisions. In a devolved system, local governments have clear and legally recognized geographical boundaries over which they exercise authority and within which they perform public functions. It is this type of administrative decentralization that underlies most political decentralization. The third one is the fiscal decentralization. Fiscal responsibility is a core component of decentralization. If local governments and private organizations are to carry out decentralized functions effectively, they must have an adequate level of revenues, either raised locally or transferred from the central government, as well as the authority to make decisions about expenditures. Fiscal decentralization can take many forms, including a. Self-financing or cost recovery through user charges, b. Co-financing or co-production arrangements through which the users participate in providing services and infrastructure through monetary or labor contributions. C. Expansion of local revenues through property or sales taxes or indirect charges. D. Intergovernmental transfers that shift general revenues from taxes collected by the central government to local governments for general or specific uses. And E. Authorization of municipal borrowing and the mobilization of either national or local government resources through loan guarantees. In many developing countries, local governments or administrative units possess the legal authority to impose taxes, but the tax base is so weak and the dependence on central government subsidies so ingrained that no attempt is made to exercise the authority. The last one is the market decentralization, or also known as economic decentralization. The most complete forms of decentralization from a government's perspective are privatization and deregulation because they shift responsibility for functions from the public to the private sector. Privatization and deregulation are usually, but not always, accompanied by economic liberalization and market development policies. They allow functions that had been primarily or exclusively the responsibility of government to be carried out by businesses, community groups, cooperatives, private voluntary associations, and other non-government organizations. So, what does privatization and deregulation means? So, let me discuss first the privatization. It can range in scope from leaving the provision of goods and services entirely to the free operation of the market to public-private partnerships in which government and the private sector cooperate to provide services or infrastructures. Privatization can include, number one, allowing private enterprises to perform functions that had previously been monopolized by government. Number two, contracting out the provision or management of public services or facilities to commercial enterprises. Indeed, there is a wide range of possible ways in which function can be organized, and many examples of within public sector and public-private institutional forms, particularly in infrastructures, for example, the bridges and transportations. Number three, financing public sector programs through the capital market with adequate regulation or measures to prevent situations where the central government bears the risk for this borrowing and allowing private organizations to participate. And lastly, transferring responsibility for providing services from the public to the private sector through the divestiture of state-owned enterprises. The next one is the regulation. The regulation reduces the legal constraints on private participation in service provision or allows competition among private suppliers for services that in the past had been provided by the government or by regulated monopolies. For example, the gasoline, the electricity, like that. In recent years, privatization and deregulation have become more attractive alternatives to governments in developing countries. Local governments are also privatizing by contracting out service provision or administration. So let's move on to the rural local government and urban local administration in the Philippine settings. Now, let's proceed to the rural local government. The rural local government is the third tier of Indian federalism. It derives its power and share of resources from the respective states. In the Philippines, there is what they call the Philippine Rural Development Project or PRDP. This is a 6-year national government project implemented by the DA which aims to increase rural incomes and enhance farm and fishery productivity in 16 regions and 80 provinces and make the agriculture and fishery sector more market-oriented and climate resilient. Specifically, the project seeks to achieve the following: at least 5% increase annually in real household incomes of farmer beneficiaries, 30% increase in income of beneficiaries involved with enterprise development, 7% increase in value of annual mark output, and 20% increase in the number of farmers and fishers with improved access to the services of the DA. To achieve its objectives, the PRDP implements four interrelated components, namely local and national planning, infrastructure development, enterprise development, and project support. This project will directly contribute to SDG 2.3 and 2.4 in increasing agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers and ensuring sustainable food production systems, respectively. And the last one is the urban local administration. Urban local government is the major supplier of essential civic services and facilities in our urban areas, and it represents grassroots democracy at the local level. Urban governance is primarily concerned with the processes through which government is organized and delivered in towns and cities and the relationships between state agencies and civil society, a term that is used to include citizens, communities, private sectors, and voluntary organizations. Urban planning in the Philippines is a shared responsibility of national and subnational levels of government, but local governments are considered to be the key in urban development. So that's all. I hope that you understand the types of decentralization and the rural and urban local government in the Philippine settings. Thank you.